Conrad Ashworth slapped my wife in a hospital corridor on a Monday afternoon and walked away smiling. And that smile. That specific 11-second clip of a man hitting a pregnant nurse and finding it amusing is the reason his company spent the next 30 days in the most expensive version of a reckoning that private equity law allows. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is a habit of mine when I am angry. And I was angry that Monday. Quietly. Precisely. The specific variety of angry that does not raise its voice. My name is Bryce Johnston. I am 52 years old. I live in River Oaks, which is a neighborhood in Houston, Texas, where the streets are wide and the trees are old, and the houses are the kind that don't announce themselves unless you already know what they cost. I am a private investor. I have been a private investor for 26 years, and before that, I was a commercial real estate attorney for 12, which means I have spent the better part of my adult life reading contracts with the specific attention that people apply to documents they understand will matter later. That habit has served me well. My wife, Sandra, is 48. She is a registered nurse, a charge nurse specifically in the cardiac care unit at Memorial Hermann Texas Medical Center on Fannin Street in the Texas Medical Center. She has been a nurse for 24 years. She works 4 days a week, 12-hour shifts, and she comes home tired in a specific way that people who do genuinely necessary work come home tired. Not the tiredness of a difficult meeting, but the tiredness of a person who has been responsible for human lives all day and is now finally allowed to put that responsibility down. She was 7 months pregnant on the Monday this happened. The call came at 4:47 p.m. I was in my home office on the second floor, reviewing a quarterly report from one of my portfolio companies, when my phone buzzed. Sandra's voice was controlled in the way it gets when she is managing something difficult and does not want me to hear the managing. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I'm fine. The baby is fine. I want you to hear that first." "I'm listening," I told her. "A man hit me in the corridor outside the nursing station. I was carrying charts. He was coming out of a private patient room, moving fast, and I was in his way. And a pause. He hit me open hand across the face. And then he looked at me and he walked away." "Which corridor?" I asked. "4 East," she said. "By the elevator bank." "Did he say anything?" "He said, 'Watch where you're going.'" Another pause. "He was smiling when he walked away. Bryce, he smiled." I looked at the wall of my home office for a moment. "Are you injured?" I asked. "No, I'm fine. The baby's fine. I had the charge supervisor check me over." "Is there a security camera on 4 East?" Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "There's one by the elevator bank." "Good," I told her. "Come home when your shift ends. Don't file a complaint yet. Don't speak to anyone about it tonight. I need to make a call first." "Bryce," she said carefully. "What are you going to do?" "Nothing dramatic," I told her. "I'm going to call Helen." I should explain the context, because the context is the whole story. 11 years ago, I identified Ashworth Capital Group as an undervalued mid-size private equity and commercial real estate firm with strong fundamentals and a founder who was, by most external measures, a capable operator. Conrad Ashworth had built the company from a regional real estate brokerage in Galveston into a Houston-based private equity operation with roughly $4 billion in assets under management. The growth had been real. The financials were clean. The public-facing operation was well run. I invested through my holding company, JB Capital Partners. Not directly. Through an intermediary structure that is standard in silent investment agreements of this type. The investment was structured to protect both parties. Conrad retained operational control. I received economic participation. And the agreement included a set of standard protective clauses that my attorney at the time, a thorough man named Ray, who has since retired, insisted on including. One of those clauses was the moral turpitude provision. Moral turpitude clauses are not unusual in private equity investor agreements. They exist to protect major investors from being economically bound to a company whose principal has engaged in conduct that materially harms the company's public standing or valuation. The specific language in my agreement with Ashworth Capital Group. I know this because I had read it recently as part of a routine annual review. Used the phrase, "conduct a reasonable investor," would find materially harmful to the company's public reputation or standing, irrespective of whether such conduct results in criminal charges or conviction. That last clause, irrespective of whether such conduct results in criminal charges, was Ray's language. He had been very particular about it. Conrad Ashworth had never met me in person. He knew JB Capital Partners as a silent investor. He knew the holding company, not the human being behind it. And because I had been for 11 years, exactly the kind of investor that founders prefer. Quiet, non-interfering, present only in the quarterly reports. There had been no occasion for him to learn anything more. He did not know my face. He did not know my wife's name. He had no reason to. That Monday afternoon, walking fast out of a private patient room on 4 East at Memorial Hermann, he had seen a pregnant nurse in a blue uniform who was in his way, and he had responded in the way of a man who has spent so long not being held accountable for anything that he had genuinely forgotten that accountability was a mechanism that existed. The smile, I kept thinking. It was the smile. Helen Morse's office is on Southwest 12th Avenue. I called her at 5:03 p.m. while the quarterly report sat untouched on my desk. Helen has been my attorney for 9 years. She is methodical, precise, and possessed of a quality I value above all third in a legal professional. She does not make promises she cannot keep, which means that when she says something is possible, it is actually possible. She answered on the second ring. "Bryce!" Her voice was the voice of someone who keeps a clean desk and knows where everything is. "I need you to obtain the security footage from Memorial Hermann Texas Medical Center, 4 East Corridor, Monday the 7th, between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. I told her. My wife was assaulted in that corridor at approximately 4:30. The footage will show it. A brief pause. "Is Sandra all right?" Helen asked. "She is. I need the footage before the hospital standard retention cycle processes it. I also need you to pull the Ashworth Capital Group investor agreement from my file, specifically the moral turpitude provision." Section 8C. A longer pause. "Bryce," Helen said carefully, "is the person in the footage who I think it might be. I don't know yet," I told her. Sandra didn't recognize him, but the room he was coming out of is a private patient suite. Find out who was admitted to that suite on Monday. "I can have someone at the hospital records office first thing tomorrow," she said. "Tonight, if possible." I told her. "I'd like to know what we're looking at before morning." Helen was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "I'll call you." Sandra came home at 7:22 p.m. She was composed in the specific way she is composed after hard days. Not pretending nothing happened, but having processed enough of it to be present. I had dinner ready because that is what I do when there is nothing useful to do yet, and because it was something I could control. We ate at the kitchen table. She told me the full account of the afternoon, the chart she was carrying, the corner of 4 East by the elevator bank, the speed of the man coming out of the suite, the impact, the look on his face, the smile as he walked away. "Did anyone else see it?" I asked. "A medical student," she said. "She was at the nursing station. She came over immediately. Does she know the man? No. Sandra looked at me. Bryce, who do you think he is? I'm not certain yet. I told her. I have a working theory. Helen is finding out. Sandra looked at me with the expression she uses when she is deciding how much to ask. When you find out, she said. Are you going to do something stupid? I picked up my fork. No, I told her. I'm going to do something methodical. Helen called at 9:47 p.m. The room on 4 East had been occupied by a private patient under a corporate billing arrangement from Ashworth Capital Group. The authorized visitor log included one name, Conrad Ashworth. I thanked Helen, hung up, and sat at the kitchen table for a while. Sandra had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The Houston night was warm through the kitchen window. I pulled up the Ashworth Capital Group investor agreement on my laptop. I found Section 8C. I read it 3 times. Irrespective of whether such conduct results in criminal charges or conviction. I closed the laptop. I went to bed. I did not sleep immediately. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about the smile. 11 seconds of security footage I had not yet seen, but could already picture with sufficient clarity. And I thought about Ray, my former attorney, who had been very particular about that language. Thank you, Ray, I thought. That was the last quiet night for a while. Welcome back to sweet family revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these accounts had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. Helen called me the following morning at 7:15 a.m. I have the footage, she said. The hospital's legal department was cooperative once I explained the nature of the request. A pause. Bryce? I've watched it. And, I asked. It's unambiguous, Judge Helen said. He was moving at speed. She was in the corridor. He struck her open hand. Deliberate contact. Not incidental. And then he looked directly at her, said something, and walked to the elevator. The footage includes his face clearly on both the approach and the departure. The smile, I said. The smile, she confirmed. 11 seconds total. Clear facial identification at multiple points. Another pause. This is actionable on multiple grounds. Criminal assault, civil battery. But I understand you want to talk about AC first. Yes, I said. I do. Then come in at 9, she said. We have work to do. Then Helen's conference room is on the 4th floor of a building on Southwest 12th Avenue, with a view of downtown Houston, through the east-facing window that is better in the morning than in the afternoon, because of how the light sits on the glass. Towers. I arrived at 9 a.m. on October 8th, one day after the corridor. Helen was already at the table with the investor agreement printed and tabbed, a yellow legal pad, and coffee she had made herself rather than having brought in, which is a quality I find reassuring in a professional. She slid the printed agreement across to me. Walk me through your interpretation of 8C before I give you mine, she said. This is a technique Helen uses when she wants to know whether a client's understanding of a document is aligned with hers before she commits to a legal strategy. It is a good technique. 8C gives me the right to trigger a forced buyout of my 23% stake in the event of conduct by the principal Conrad Ashworth that a reasonable investor would find materially harmful to the company's public standing, I said. The clause specifically excludes the requirement of a criminal conviction. It requires only that the conduct meet the standard of material harm to public standing. Helen nodded slowly. And your argument is that being identified on security footage, striking a pregnant nurse in a hospital corridor, footage that exists, that is clear, and that shows deliberate contact followed by a smile, meets that standard. Yes, I said. Agree, Helen said. With one condition. She tapped page 44. The clause requires that the conduct be made known to a reasonable investor before the buyout can be triggered. The agreement does not require public disclosure. It requires that the conduct be documented and presented. We satisfy that condition with the security footage and my request for the buyout meeting. I looked at the tabbed page. There's something else, I said. Helen looked at me. The 11-second clip, I said. If it were to come to the attention of, say, a business journalist who covers private equity in Houston commercial real estate before the buyout meeting, but after we filed the formal trigger notice, Conrad's legal team would be managing two crises simultaneously, the forced buyout trigger and a public narrative. Helen was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to advise you to do that, she said carefully. But I'm going to note that the footage is a matter of record obtained through proper legal channels that reflects actual events that occurred in a public corridor of a hospital. Its existence and the circumstances of its creation are factual. I understand, I said, if a journalist were to receive it from a source other than my office. Helen continued in the same careful tone. That would be a matter entirely outside my knowledge or involvement. I nodded once. Let's file the trigger notice this afternoon, I said. Helen picked up her pen. I'll have it drafted by noon, she said. I want to tell you about what 23% of Ashworth Capital Group actually represented, because the number is important, and because I don't want you to misunderstand what the trigger notice meant. Over 11 years, the company had grown from approximately $400 million in assets under management to just over $4 billion. My initial investment through JB Capital Partners had been $47 million. The buyout formula in my agreement was based on a standard private equity valuation methodology. A multiple of the company's average annual earnings over the preceding 3 years applied to my percentage stake. The number that Helen's financial analyst produced when she ran the calculation was $218 million. That was what Ashworth Capital Group was contractually obligated to pay me if the moral turpitude clause was successfully triggered. Not a punishment, not a penalty, just the contractual consequence of an agreement that Conrad Ashworth had signed 11 years ago, and I would learn had not reviewed in some time. The trigger notice was filed at 2:34 p.m. on October 8th. It was delivered to Ashworth Capital Group's legal department by courier. Not email. Courier because I wanted a delivery receipt, and to Conrad Ashworth's personal attorney of record. The notice cited Section 8C, documented the incident of October 7th, referenced the security footage as an attached exhibit, and formally requested a buyout meeting within 15 business days per the agreement's terms. Helen called me when the courier confirmed delivery. It's done, she said. His legal team will have it within the hour. How long before they respond? I asked. Given the amount and the circumstances, I'd expect a call from his lead attorney within 48 hours, Helen said. They'll want to negotiate before they formally respond. Are we negotiating? I asked. No, she said. We're enforcing. The journalist's name was Karen Birch. She covered private equity and commercial real estate for a financial publication based in New York with a Houston bureau. She had broken 3 significant stories in the Houston business community in the previous 2 years and had a reputation for documentation standards that were, by the accounts of people I trusted, thorough. I did not contact her directly. I have a contact, a former colleague, a man named Pete, who has been in Houston business journalism for 20 years and knows Karen Birch professionally. I called Pete on the evening of October 8th. I have something that might be of interest to Karen Birch, I told him. It involves a piece of security footage, a public incident in a hospital corridor, and a private equity principal whose company has some institutional investors who might be interested in the question of conduct standards. Does this involve anyone whose company I might have in my portfolio? He asked. Pete's driveway of asking if there was a conflict of interest for him. Personally, no, I said. Can you tell me the name? Conrad Ashworth, I said. Ashworth Capital Group. Another pause. I'll give her your number, Pete said. Karen Birch called me the following morning, October 9th, 8:22 a.m. She asked 3 questions before she said anything else. She asked whether I was certain the footage showed what I said it showed. She asked whether the footage had been legally obtained. She asked whether I had a personal interest in Ashworth Capital Group. I answered yes, and yes to all 3. If you have a personal financial interest, she said, your motivation for sharing this is going to be a part of the story. I understand, I said. I'd rather it be in the story than not mentioned. The motivation is clear. I am a major investor in a company whose principal assaulted my pregnant wife, and I am exercising my contractual rights. I'm not hiding any part of that. Karen Birch was quiet for a moment. Send me the footage, she said. The story ran on October 10th. It ran at 6:47 a.m., which is before the New York markets opened, which meant that institutional investors with positions in Ashworth Capital Group's publicly disclosed partnerships read over their morning coffee before their trading desks came online. The headline was Ashworth Capital Group faces forced investor buyout following hospital incident. Security footage cited. I read it at my kitchen table with Sandra sitting across from me. She had read it first while I was making coffee, and when I came back to the table, she was looking at her phone with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Bryce, she said. Yes, I said. Your name isn't in the article. No, I said. JB Capital Partners is named as the investor. Not me. She looked at me. He still doesn't know, she said. No, I said. He doesn't. Sandra looked back at her phone. She was quiet for a moment. Is this going to work? She asked. Helen thinks the clause is clean, I told her. The 30 days are going to be complicated. But yes, I think it's going to work. She set down the phone. I'm going to work, she said. Be careful, I told her. She kissed me on the forehead and picked up her bag. I'm always careful, she said. Unlike some people. I watched her walk out of the kitchen, and I thought about the smile. 11 seconds clear facial identification, and I thought 30 days. 30 days. If you've been listening for a while and want accounts like this to keep coming, it really helps when you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do. But it's what keeps this whole thing running. So thank you, for real. Conrad Ashworth's lead attorney called Helen at 11:15 a.m. on October 10th. 3 hours and 28 minutes after the story ran. His name was Stuart Pratt. Helen described him to me afterward as efficient and not surprised. The voice of a man who had spent his career managing the consequences of his client's behavior and had developed a professional equanimity about it. He opened with the procedural argument. Helen told me. His position is that 8C requires a criminal conviction before the buyout can be triggered. And you said, I asked. I directed him to the specific language of the clause, which does not use the word conviction anywhere, and which explicitly states irrespective of criminal charges. A pause. He's going to fight it. He filed a formal objection to the trigger notice this afternoon. Expected, I said. Yes, Helen said. His argument is more interesting. He's arguing that the incident was incidental, that the contact was accidental, and the footage is being mischaracterized. I thought about the smile. He's seen the footage, I said. His office requested a copy from the hospital's legal department yesterday, Helen said. They've seen it. Yes. With the smile, I said. With the smile, Helen confirmed. which is their weakest argument, and they know it, which tells me they're going to move to the procedural question quickly and hope to make the clause fight longer than our 30-day window. Can they? I asked. Not if we move to emergency injunctive relief to preserve the trigger notice's validity during the dispute, Helen said. I filed that motion this morning before he called. That, I thought, is why I pay her what I pay her. What's the timeline? I asked. The injunction hearing is October 21st, Helen said. 11 days if we win the injunction. The 30-day clock stays running, and they have to complete the buyout, or face a breach of contract action on top of the moral turpitude claim. And if we lose the injunction, I asked. We don't lose the injunction, Helen said in the tone she uses when she has already done the analysis, and the analysis supports her. The language of the clause is clear. The conduct is documented. The public standing harm is quantifiable. Their stock equivalent positions dropped 14% this morning. We don't lose the injunction. I looked at the Houston skyline through my home office window. All right, I said. See you on the 21st. The injunction hearing was October 21st, in a conference room at the American Arbitration Association's Houston office on Post Oak Boulevard. It was not a courtroom. Private equity disputes of this type are typically resolved through arbitration, per the investor agreement's dispute resolution clause. But it had the specific gravity of a formal proceeding because both sides prepared for it as one. Helen brought Paul Garrett, a forensic financial analyst who had prepared a 40-page report in the 14% stock position decline and its correlation to the October 10th news story. She brought a declaration from a private equity law expert at Rice University's business school, which addressed the standard industry interpretation of moral turpitude clauses in investor agreements, and she brought me. Conrad Ashworth did not attend. His attorney, Stuart Pratt, attended with 2 junior associates and a financial consultant. I arrived at 9 a.m. I sat on the left side of the table. Stuart Pratt sat on the right. The arbitrator, a retired judge named Walter, who had the demeanor of a man who had heard every possible argument and maintained a studied neutrality about all of them, sat at the head. Before we begin, Walter said, I want to confirm that both parties have reviewed the exhibits submitted to my office. Stuart Pratt confirmed they had. Helen confirmed we had. Stuart Pratt's opening argument took 32 minutes. It was, as Helen had predicted, primarily procedural, built around the argument that the clause required a criminal conviction and that the trigger notice was therefore premature and invalid. He cited 3 comparable cases from other jurisdictions. He was organized and precise. When he finished, Helen stood. She spoke for 19 minutes. She directed the arbitrator to the specific language of Section 8C 4 times. She presented Paul Garrett's analysis of the stock position decline. She presented the security footage, all 11 seconds of it, via a laptop connected to a screen at the end of the table. The room watched the 11 seconds. Walter watched the footage without expression. Stuart Pratt watched it without expression. I watched Stuart Pratt. The clause does not require criminal conviction, Helen said after the footage ended. The clause requires conduct that a reasonable investor would find materially harmful to the company's public standing. We have offered 3 independent forms of evidence that the public standing has been materially harmed. The security footage itself, the news coverage that resulted from it, and the quantified market response. The trigger notice is valid. The buyout obligation stands. Walter looked at Stuart Pratt. Counselor, he said, your response to the footage. Stuart Pratt set down his pen. Our position, he said carefully, is that the contact was incidental and the footage is being characterized in the most damaging possible light. Walter looked at him for a moment. The subject of the footage is smiling, Walter said as he walks away from a pregnant woman he has just struck. A silence. Yes, Stuart Pratt said. That is not a characterization, Walter said. That is what is in the footage. Another silence. Stuart Pratt straightened his notes. We maintain our procedural objection, he said. Walter looked at his own legal pad. He wrote something. He looked up. The injunction is granted, he said. The trigger notice retains its validity for the duration of the dispute. The 30-day buyout clock continues to run from the original notice date of October 8th. He looked at both sides of the table. Counsel, I'd encourage your client to review the clause language carefully before this returns to me. Good morning. The complication arrived on October 24th, 3 days after the injunction hearing and 14 days into the 30-day window. Helen called me at 3:45 p.m. Stuart Pratt filed a secondary challenge this morning, she said. His new argument is that JB Capital Partners is not the same legal entity as the original investor on the agreement due to a restructuring of the holding company in 2019. And therefore, the trigger rights may not have transferred correctly. I sat down. Is there anything to that? I asked. There is a technical argument to be made, Helen said carefully. The 2019 restructuring involved a standard reorganization. The investment and all associated rights transferred to the new entity by operation of law per the agreement's assignment clause. But he's going to make us prove it, and proving it takes time, and time is what he's buying. Short sentences. Quick decisions. What do we need? I asked. The 2019 restructuring documents, Helen said. The assignment records. The original agreement's assignment clause language. I have all of it. I told her. In my home office. Physical copies. I need them today, she said. I'll bring them now, I said. I was in Helen's office by 4:30 p.m. with a manila envelope containing every document from the 2019 restructuring. The kind of documentation that meticulous people maintain, not because they expect to need it, but because that is simply how meticulous people operate. Helen reviewed the documents that evening and filed a response to Stuart Pratt's secondary challenge the following morning. The response took 14 pages to make a simple point. The assignment clause on page 62 of the investor agreement specifically stated that all rights and obligations transferred automatically to any successor entity in a standard reorganization without requiring consent of the other party. The 2019 restructuring was a standard reorganization. The documents proved it. Stuart Pratt withdrew the secondary challenge on October 28th. The 30-day window expired on November 7th. The buyout closed on November 5th, 2 days early, which Helen had pushed for and which Stuart Pratt's client had ultimately accepted rather than face a breach of contract action on top of everything else. The amount was $218 million, paid by wire transfer from Ashworth Capital Group's operating accounts to JB Capital Partners at 2:17 p.m. on November 5th. I was in my home office when the confirmation came through. Sandra was at work. I called her. It's done, I told her. She was quiet for a moment. How much? She asked. I told her. Another pause. Bryce, she said. Yes, I said. That's a lot of money. Are you going to do something sensible with it? I looked out the window at the River Oaks street below. The wide, quiet street. The old trees. The November light on the pavement. I have one thing to do first, I told her. Then I'll be sensible. And the flowers arrive every Tuesday. They come from a florist on Westheimer Road in Houston's Montrose neighborhood. An arrangement of white peonies and garden roses. Seasonal. Professionally done. They are delivered to Sandra's name at the Cardiac Care Unit at Memorial Hermann, 4th floor, with a card that reads only, "For the nurse who deserved better." They are charged to a corporate account that Sandra has no connection to and will never trace. Conrad Ashworth does not know he is paying for them. The account was set up by a financial services firm, funded by a modest portion of the buyout proceeds, enough to run for 40 years at the current delivery rate. Compounding conservatively, the florist has standing instructions. The account renews automatically. Sandra receives them every Tuesday. She has told me she doesn't know who sends them. I have told her it's probably a grateful patient's family. She suspects this is not true. She has not pushed the question. I am content with this arrangement, if you've made it this far. Do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people listen without ever doing it. It costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you. Genuinely. Now, the last thing I want to say about Conrad Ashworth, not about what happened to him, but about the assumption that made it possible. He walked down that corridor at full speed in a private hospital wing he had paid for access to, and he hit a pregnant nurse who was in his way, and he smiled. And in that smile was a complete and unexamined belief that the woman in the blue uniform was nobody. That nobody in that corridor had any connection to anything that could reach him. That the geometry of power in the room was so obvious and so fixed that he did not need to think about it for even 1 second. He was not entirely wrong about the geometry. Sandra was, by the conventional metrics of visible power, in a much lower position in that corridor. She was a nurse in a uniform. He was a billionaire in a tailored jacket. The room looked exactly like what he assumed it was. What he did not know, could not have known, because I had been careful. Was that the most expensive piece of real estate in that corridor was not the private patient suite he was walking out of. It was the 23% stake that had been quietly sitting in his company's capital structure for 11 years, attached to language that a thorough attorney had written in 2013, on the specific theory that the person signing the agreement might one day do something a reasonable investor would find materially harmful. Ray had been very particular about that language. The lesson, and I mean this seriously, not as a rhetorical flourish, is about the danger of visible metrics. We assess the power of a room based on what we can see, the size of the office, the quality of the suit, the confidence of the entrance. These are real signals, and they are often accurate, but they are never complete. Because power that is designed to be invisible, capital held through holding companies, equity stakes held by people who have no reason to announce themselves, contractual rights attached to agreements no one has reviewed recently, does not appear in the visible geometry of any room. Conrad Ashworth had been operating for years on the assumption that the invisible things in his world were safe, that the silent investors were silent because they were passive, that the clauses in his agreements were theoretical, that the corridors of the buildings he walked through contained no one who had a claim on his future. He was wrong about all of it, and he was wrong specifically because he had never had reason to question the assumption. That is the specific danger of unchecked power. It produces a man who stops checking his assumptions, who walks at full speed, who smiles, not because he is a monster, though the smile is hard to characterize charitably, but because he has operated for so long without consequence. That consequence has ceased to feel like a real category. Consequence is always a real category. I am not a cruel man. I did not enjoy the process of the past 30 days in the way that people sometimes imagine wealthy men enjoy financial combat. What I felt throughout the injunction hearing and the secondary challenge and the buyout closing was not satisfaction. It was something more like the specific, quiet completion of a task that needed to be done correctly. Sandra comes home on Tuesdays and tells me about the flowers. She describes the arrangement, the peonies, the roses, the card. And she says she wishes she knew who was sending them so she could thank them properly. And I listen, and I make dinner. And I think about man in a tailored jacket walking away down a hospital corridor with a smile on his face. I think he knows now. He knows that the nurse in the corridor had a name he should have checked. He knows that the holding company he had forgotten about was run by a man he had never thought to meet. He knows that 11 seconds of security footage and a clause on page 44 were enough to cost him $218 million, and the confidence he had spent years building around the belief that he was untouchable. He does not know about the flowers. He doesn't know that a modest portion of the money he paid, automatically by wire transfer on November 5th at 2:17 p.m., flows every Tuesday into a florist account on Westheimer Road that will keep running for 40 years. He pays for them. He will always pay for them, and Sandra will always receive them. That is the ending I chose. Not a prosecution, not a public humiliation, not a crusade. By the time everything was finished, I wasn't interested in spectacle anymore. Spectacle burns brightly for a day and is forgotten by the next news cycle. I wanted something quieter than that, something proportionate, something that reminded me justice doesn't always arrive wearing handcuffs. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a clause on page 43 of an agreement everyone else skimmed without reading. The man who hit my wife still goes to work every Monday morning believing the story ended years ago. He signs reports, attends meetings, reviews budgets, every Friday afternoon. A payment is processed exactly as the contract requires. A small amount compared to the size of the company, almost invisible among thousands of ordinary transactions. Enough to cover fresh flowers every week for the memorial garden that bears my wife's name. He pays for those flowers. He has been paying for them for years. He will continue paying for them for the rest of his professional career. He doesn't know it. He can't redirect it. He can't vote to remove it. He agreed to it himself 11 years earlier. When his signature appeared beneath language, my attorney insisted remain exactly as written, despite everyone else calling it unnecessary. That's what experience looks like. It notices consequences long before anyone else notices possibilities. Every Saturday morning, I stop by the garden on my way to the grocery store. Different flowers depending on the season. Tulips in the spring, sunflowers in late summer, white chrysanthemums when autumn arrives. The gardener knows me well enough now that we rarely need many words. He'll nod toward the newest arrangement, and I'll smile, because he always remembers which flowers she loved most. The garden is beautiful not because it's expensive, but because someone keeps caring for it week after week. That's how remembrance works. Quietly, consistently, without asking permission from the people who once believed they would never be held accountable. Looking back, I understand that the contract was never really about money. It was about foresight. My attorney used to say that good contracts aren't written for the days when everyone gets along. They're written for the day someone decides they no longer wants to do the right thing. Character is wonderful when it's present. Documentation is essential when it isn't. Those two ideas carried me through more than one difficult season. People sometimes ask whether I ever wanted revenge. I usually tell them the truth. At first. Yes, grief often mistakes revenge for relief. It takes time to learn they aren't the same thing. Relief comes when you no longer need the other person to understand what they've done before you're able to continue living your own life. Revenge keeps you tied to yesterday. Resolution quietly returns you to tomorrow. I'm grateful I eventually learned the difference. The flowers bloom whether he thinks about them or not. That's enough for me. The memorial doesn't require his remorse. It requires only that the agreement continue doing exactly what it was designed to do. That's the remarkable thing about foundations built correctly. Once they're in place, they keep carrying the weight without demanding constant attention. My wife would have appreciated that irony. She always believed the strongest people were usually the quietest ones in the room. She was right about most things. She was certainly right about that. Every time I sit on the bench beside those flowers, I think less about the accident and more about the years we had before it. Funny how healing changes your memories. At first, every beautiful moment reminds you of what you've lost. Eventually, every beautiful moment reminds you of what you were lucky enough to have. That's a much gentler way to remember someone. If this story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this: build the foundation before you need it. Read every contract before you sign it. Ask the extra question everyone else is too impatient to ask. And never, under any circumstances, assume that the quiet person standing at the end of the corridor has no influence over how the story ends. The most important person in the room is often the one nobody has bothered to notice yet. They may not speak the loudest. They may not carry the biggest title. But when the moment arrives, they are often the one who quietly changes everything. That's how this story ended. Not with applause, not with headlines, just fresh flowers every week, a promise kept exactly as written, and a foundation that proved strong enough to outlast the man who underestimated it. In the end, that was more than enough. If you liked this account, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.